Okay, good morning everyone. We're going to kick off the session now. Welcome to our webinar on Beyond Our Own Operations, how businesses can help build a sustainable London, which the Aldersgate Group is organising in coordination with Repowering London. I'm Nick Mollo, the Executive Director of the Aldersgate Group. For those of you who don't know us very well, we are a cross-economy business organisations focused on how we can tackle some of today's most challenging areas of environmental policy in a way that's not only environmentally effective, but can also deliver economic and social benefit. And as you'll see from the slide here, we have a very broad membership with businesses coming from a wide range of different parts of the economy, but also academic institutions, leading NGOs and professional institutes who all contribute to our policy work in all of those areas. And we work across the piece, from climate and energy policy through to resources and waste policy, green finance, trade policy, and nature restoration. Now, to put this a bit in context, I think it's important to have a look at what's happening in Glasgow at COP26. And of course, over the last 10 days, we've heard many announcements being made at a high level with commitments, for example, on halting deforestations, on moving to more restorative practices in agriculture. We've seen agreements to speed up the spread of renewable electricity, electric vehicles, and so on. And whilst a lot of those commitments are made at a global level and may seem quite high level, it's important to remember that, of course, the intention is that if these pledges are properly implemented on the ground, they will have an impact in towns, in cities, in local communities. And a good example of that, I think, is the so-called Glasgow Breakthroughs, which was an initiative launched early last week by several countries and hosted by the UK presidency. And the whole idea behind the Glasgow Breakthroughs is to make clean technologies in areas such as power, in areas such as transport, agriculture, hydrogen and steel, as affordable as possible by 2030, so that they can be as accessible as possible to as many countries, towns, cities and communities across the globe. And it's very much that link between high-level pledges and action on the ground that we want to focus our event on today. And we thought we would use the opportunity of today being the Cities, Regions and Built Environment Day to have a discussion around what businesses can do to ensure that their efforts to go towards net zero emissions and their broader environmental sustainability efforts can actually deliver benefits to communities on the ground, with a particular focus today on London. And more specifically, how can businesses use their own sustainability and net zero ambitions to not only create jobs in their local communities, but also deliver better spaces, better infrastructure, and deliver social responsibility schemes that really benefit local communities. And that's really the spirit of our event today. So we've got a very knowledgeable panel and coming from a range of different perspectives today to discuss these issues. And I'd like to welcome our co-host, Dr. Afshin Kabir Rashid MBE, who's the CEO of Repowering London. And Repowering London sat with the Aldersgate Group on the recent Green Jobs Task Force hosted by the UK government, where we spoke a lot about delivering the net zero transition needing to deliver benefit at a local level. We also have Sam Priest with us today, who is a partner at Environmental Resources Management, Maria Smith, who are Director of Sustainability and Physics at Bureau Happold, Ronan Layden, who's Head of Sustainable Places at Bioregional, Richard O'Brien, who is Corporate Finance Manager at Triodos Bank, and Andrew Dakers, Chief Executive at West London Business. Now, we've asked our panelists to each make contributions of between 5 to 7 minutes this morning, and we've asked them to focus, I guess, on three key things. First of all, to give us an idea of the kind of projects they are involved in or have been advising in on the ground, and how environmentally sustainable projects are delivering benefits to communities across London. But we then asked them to really focus on the future and looking at what they see as the main opportunities and benefits of the net zero transition for local communities, but also to highlight any potential barriers or omissions that we need to overcome in order to make sure that as we move towards the UK's overall net zero target by 2050, we really do a good job of bringing communities with us and ensuring that communities benefit from this transition, not just in economic terms, but in social terms and a better quality of life terms. So that's the overall focus of today. Once our panelists have spoken, we'll have around half an hour for Q&As. So please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box. We'll try and go through as many of them as possible. And a recording of the webinar will also be made available afterwards if you wish to see it again or share it with colleagues. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Afshin.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for collaborating with us on this webinar today. Welcome, everyone. I'm Afshin, and co-founder and CEO of Repowering, and at Repowering, we specialize in local energy projects. We work with communities to build, fund, and plan their low-carbon futures. And our vision is about creating a fairer, cleaner energy future that enables those communities to benefit and participate. And we know the transition to net zero is really complex and challenging, particularly the energy transition. For those of you who work in the energy sector will know. And our mission really is to make sure that no Londoner is left behind and that they can participate and benefit from these schemes. We work in London's most deprived communities, and that's where our root is, and that's where we originated from, for example, from Brixton in South London, in Lambeth. And our way of working is really developed around that particular social economic demographic. And so how do we go about creating this cleaner, fairer energy future? So some of the things that we do, we create community-owned solar power stations. And this could be community-owned solar panels on a school, on a social housing estate, or a community purpose building. And what's key here is that local people can invest in these schemes. They get a return on their investment. Our schemes have provided a 3% return on the investment people have put in. But it's not only about investment. These projects are housed in cooperatives. And so local people who can't invest can still be part of the co-op by joining with a £1 membership. They still have equal say in decision-making and control, how the surplus incomes get spent. That equality, that element of one member, one vote represents those democratic principles, which really empowers our communities. And what we have seen is that our projects aren't only about community generation, renewable energy generation, it's also about tackling fuel poverty. And I wanted to share the example of one of our energy co-ops, which is in North Kensington. We started 4 years ago. North Kensington Community Energy didn't exist. We collaborated with the council and local residents. And from the start of the project, there was just a few individuals who came forward. But today, North Kensington Community Energy is led by 15 local volunteers and directors. It has installed solar panels on 4 community buildings. They've created a community fund for the lifetime of the project for £75,000. They've already started putting that money back into the community by encouraging others to put solar panels as well. And the group is empowered now, and they're running greener living days, and they're linking energy with other sustainable lifestyles and behaviors and bringing more people behind them. And as I said, our projects are beyond just a generation of electricity. We also tackle fuel poverty. And over last year, particularly through the pandemic, our Brixton Energy Co-ops have been operational for 10 years. They put money aside to help those most vulnerable in the community by funding fuel emergency vouchers. So those people who weren't able to heat their homes and eat were able to do so, and they were, we had supported them with giving them energy advice from those who were at risk of disconnection and self-rationing. So that was how a community group was able to really step in and support their most vulnerable in the community. And what's really proud about our projects, and again, this comes from our Brixton roots where we were challenged very early on, what are you doing about the young people in our community? This is where we have developed a training program for young people between the age of 16 to 24-year-old. It kind of ranges. And it's a paid accredited training course. We've had 100 young people go through our training program. And this is, mind you, these young people come from the most disadvantaged communities across London. And that's our unique place where we've been able to identify them and support them in being able to open up new opportunities for them. And that totally links in with the Green Jobs Task Force that we were working on, Nick. It's about making sure that our green jobs and the green workforce tomorrow is diverse, which it isn't today. And what we're doing is really helping make sure that the green transition can benefit those in disadvantaged communities and bring that future generation through. And lastly, I wanted to say, with the committee, the Climate Change Committee, who submitted their report earlier this year, said that 60% of the measures required for us to get to net zero will require some level, if not a whole degree of behavior change and people coming behind it. And this is where community energy groups like Repowering are really best placed to bring people and encourage people on this transition and the journey to net zero. So yeah, and I'm here today to kind of welcome collaboration for us to help us scale our community energy ambitions across London. We want London to be a solar city, and that's the foundation of our vision to get to a local energy service model. As a result of that, we will be empowering communities, attacking fuel poverty, bringing those who are most vulnerable along with us in this journey, as well as creating a workforce that is diverse and ready for the green future.
Thank you, Afshin. And just you did a very eloquent job of pointing out the important role that communities have in supporting that, in delivering that net zero transition, and you've said a lot about the energy sector in particular. Are there other areas where you think local communities will have an important role to play in facilitating the transition to a low carbon economy, but where also they could benefit? So on energy, it's clear that good advice can actually help deliver important objectives on fuel poverty. Mm-hmm. But are there other areas of I guess the low carbon agenda that you think could, if done well, could benefit local communities?
Yeah, you've seen not just in the energy sector, but there is community-led initiatives in housing, food growing, transport. So there land use, the reuse economy. There's like fantastic report done by IPPR on local communities and how they've taken an approach to really being core to the climate crisis. So I think community energy groups across not just London, but across the UK are really delivering the net zero agenda already. The technical solutions are out there, the people are behind it, and it's really about helping that flourish and grow and raising awareness as well. And of course, the challenge as well is to ensure that the policy enables communities and those community-led approaches to really grow and flourish.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Afshin. Sam, I'd like to move over to you. I mean, you work for environmental resources management. You'll be advising a lot of clients from different sectors on those issues. So I'm hoping you can provide us with a good cross-cutting perspective on, where local communities stand to benefit from this.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nick. And maybe just a little bit about ERM. So as you say, we're an advisor, we're a global leading pure play sustainability advisor. So we work all over the world, but we are headquartered in London. And it's really important to us to integrate and support community activities within our home cities. And I'd say just we think about the impact that we have in several ways. So the first is through the technical work that we do, so we can have a positive impact and support initiatives, whether they're for businesses or within community-led schemes. We want to do that, and also supporting obviously with policy and positioning. I think we also have impact through the projects and the activities of the clients and partners that we work with. But probably one of the most important is through our ERMers, our people who are in communities, and through our foundation, we like to encourage and make sure that ERMers who are all very engaged and committed to the net zero ambition to to get involved with things. So I think it's that integrated approach of not trying to separate out business from community, from people. It's all totally integrated. And I think that's there's a massive urgency at the moment. That's how my sense, and that's our sense. We've got to get things moving and scaled, and that requires that integration of the personal commitment that people have, the companies, and the money that's going to be there to need to scale and move things quickly, and then obviously an enabling policy environment. So I'd say from an ERM perspective and from my personal perspective, integration and communication is going to be key for us to move quickly. And then enable sort of a number of different levels and scales of activity, all of which are equally important at the moment.
Thanks, Simon. I mean, from the work that you do and the advice you give to your clients, are there particular areas where you think local communities could really benefit from this aspect of net zero transition, but it's not really being focused on at a policy level? Are there any sort of omissions or any missed opportunities we're not focusing on at the moment?
So I do a lot of work with investors and funders, as well as corporates, and I think there's an absolute shortage of implementation. I think there's a mismatch at the moment, and there's a real desire for companies and investors to get involved and support. So I think making the connection between the two and making them compatible is something that I'm really personally passionate about, and I think there's a role and a responsibility in both directions. Don't fear and don't feel that because you're an individual or a community organization that you can't interact and get the benefit from the following wind that's coming from all of that. But I think also in the other direction, I think we've got to create enabling structuring for what we're doing to make sure that we can aggregate or enable smaller initiatives, and where there's will to do that.
Thanks very much, Sam. Now I'd like to focus a bit more on the built environment and bring you in, Smith, because obviously Bureau Happold do a huge amount, and I've seen firsthand the huge focus you put into delivering engineering advice with environmental and social considerations in mind, and obviously you do that not just in the UK but across the globe. So can you give us a bit more of a sense of how much progress are we making in making sure that the rollout of all the low carbon infrastructure we want to see is actually delivering benefits for local people, and what do we need to do next?
Sure. So thanks, Nick, and thanks Aldersgate Group and Repowering London for having me this morning. I hope you can hear me all right. Had some issues. It's great, fantastic. So I am up here in Glasgow because we have written a report called Built for the Environment, which is a kind of capability statement from the built environment industry, and a number of over 70 recommendations for the kind of policy mechanisms that you might use to bring about a transition to a fair and sustainable built environment. But that's sort of a plug thinly disguised as context, just to sort of say that I've been up at COP now for 11 days at a number of events, and I think it's really important that we're having this conversation here about how we draw this thread between the international negotiations going on and the conferences going on up here and the work happening, really sort of hard, real work happening day in, day out in businesses and communities. Because this COP is so much about getting past the targets and the sort of the words and the blah, blah, blah to real tangible action. But I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the words, because I think it's really important that we don't assume consensus. And one of the things that I've found so exhausting up here is this endless kind of reading between the lines, like translating one person's net zero for another person's, or one person's green finance for another's, or one person's emergency even. So I wanted to do a thing, and I am very sorry to the Aldersgate team for the friendly digs that are about to happen. They are not personal at all. We all use these words, and myself included, but I'm hopefully trying to make a point that is relevant to this conversation. So if you'll bear with me a moment. First, I want to just read an extract from the speaker's briefing. So businesses must look to innovative approaches to create sustainable communities. London is a global leader on this front, with many businesses taking steps to deliver low carbon projects with significant community benefits. And we, the panelists, have been asked to discuss the low carbon projects and activities that we've been involved with and the major benefits that these have provided for their local areas, to explore where support from government may be helpful to enable more initiatives that take a community-focused approach to decarbonisation. And I've personally been asked, and I'm obviously not answering this very directly, what do you see as the most effective public engagement levers that can ensure that local people are brought with us on the net zero transition? And what is the role of further regulation to ensure that social value is embedded in low carbon projects? And how can we ensure that regulation is well designed? And so I was reading this and thinking about what to sort of say this morning for my 5 to 7 minutes. And I kind of hit upon 7 terms or even themes that come up in that extract and come up again and again and again. And I was thinking about what they really mean, and sort of, I think there are kind of, there are the things that we like to think they mean, and then there are things that within the current context and system they do mean. And I think it's really important that we don't actually ignore that huge discrepancies there. So I'm going to read them out again in a minute with the different versions of that, but just to give a couple of examples. So, businesses, for example, what do we mean by businesses? Maybe we like to think, or we would hope that what that maybe means is something like cooperative stewards of resources, but what it really means, or what it can mean depending on your perspective, is more a kind of a hierarchical group of currency users organized to commandeer resources and leverage power. But what do we mean by local? Maybe literally we mean nearby, but actually so many times the phrase local is also used in with negative connotations, even to sort of mean deprived. And the etymology of that word, by the way, is to literally have something taken away from you. It's you are the kind of thievee. And so I think this kind of language is really important. And if I'm going to read again the section of the brief, swapping out some of those themes with some of the least generous interpretations, and then the most generous interpretations, to leave us all on a positive note, because I think that one person's local and another person's local are not the same. One person's climate action and another person's climate action is not the same. And so while we're moving from words to climate action, I think it's really important that we are being as explicit and clear and not assuming consensus where that isn't there. So firstly, the horrible version. Hierarchical groups of currency users organised to commandeer resources and leverage power must look to innovative approaches to create non-carbon emitting but nevertheless socially and environmentally exploitative arrangements for wage-dependent customers. London is a global leader on this front, with many hierarchical groups of currency users organised to commandeer resources and leverage power, taking steps to deliver those non-carbon emitting but nevertheless socially and environmentally exploitative projects with significant conditional privileges for wage-dependent customers. So we've been asked to discuss the non-carbon emitting exploitative projects and activities that we've been involved with, and the major conditional privileges that these have provided for their deprived areas, to explore where bestowed aid that everyone should be grateful for from a uniquely empowered currency issuer may be helpful to enable more initiatives that take a wage-dependent customer-focused approach to non-carbon emitting exploitation. And I've been asked, what do you see as the most effective wage-dependent customer placation levers that can ensure that deprived wage-dependent customers are placated on the non-carbon emitting social and environmental exploitation transition? And what is the role of further bestowed aid that everyone should be grateful for from a uniquely empowered currency issuer to ensure conditional privileges embedded in non-carbon emitting exploitative projects? And how can we ensure that the bestowed aid that we should all be grateful for from a uniquely empowered currency issuer is well designed? Some people really mean that. They just think that you don't notice. So what if instead of that, what if instead we were talking about something that was, what I think everyone in this room would really, really like to hear? What would that look like? So then maybe we'd be talking about cooperative stewards of resources must look to innovative approaches to create positive reciprocal relationships between humans and the rest of nature. London is a global leader on this front, with many cooperative stewards of resources taking steps to deliver those positive reciprocal relationships with significant rights-based access to life-giving resources for humans. We want to all be here to discuss the projects and activities engendering that positive reciprocal relationship between humans and the rest of nature that we've been involved with, and the major rights-based access to life-giving resources these have provided for their nearby areas. We want to explore where democratically elected resource provisioning may be helpful to enable more initiatives to take that humanity-focused approach to those positive reciprocal relationships. And I have been asked, what do I see as the most effective human empowerment levers that ensure that nearby humans are empowered on the transition to those positive reciprocal relationships? And what is the further role of democratically elected resource provisioning to ensure those rights-based access to life-giving resources are embedded in those positive reciprocal relationships? And how can we ensure that that democratically elected resource provisioning is well designed? So yes, those are my 7 minutes. And my plea is that we do not assume consensus between the kind of language that is used in these international negotiations, and that between those conversations that are up here and that hard work that's happening day in, day out for people and humans in their nearby areas, and that we could be having a much more fruitful conversation if we were more aware of the discrepancies between the language used.
Thanks very much. And I think it does that the importance of clear language and what people mean by every word they put down is obviously at the heart of what's happening right now at COP, with interpretations of phasing out of fossil fuels, phasing out of coal, and so I think it's a very relevant point in that context. It's also a very relevant point in the discussions that we've had over the last 2 weeks around net zero targets, because obviously in the absence actually of further criteria as to what is a credible and what isn't a credible net zero target, we have a range of net zero targets. We have some net zero targets that involve bringing emissions to zero, other corporates who will look to reduce emissions by 97-98% with 2% offset, and others who've taken a much more generous interpretation of the benefits of offsetting, with maybe say as high as 20 or 30% of offsets in their own target. So again, that's not like for like, and clarity of language here is going to be particularly important as we move to the detail of the COP negotiations in the next couple of years. So thanks very much for that. Ronan, I'd like to move to you for now. Quite a hard act to follow, but I guess from a bioregional perspective, you do an awful lot of, I guess, pilot projects on the ground where you really try and take all these different dimensions that actually we've just spoken about into practice. So we'd love to get your perspectives on that.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for having me along. Yep, so I'm Ronan Layden, Head of Sustainable Places at Bioregional. And as you've said, Nick, exactly that. We're an environmental charity. We've been running for over 25 years, and our focus is practical solutions to sustainability and zero carbon. So the only right thing for me to do is present on a practical solution. So I'm going to do that. And in the spirit of this also being co-hosted by Repowering, it's a project we're working with Repowering. So a lot of credit is actually going to go their way in this one. But so I want to talk to you guys about a project called Leveling the Renewable Energy Playing Field. And actually, if we talk about semantics, that's not the best wording, but you'll soon hear what we mean by that, and I hope you'll see it's the generous interpretation from Maria's talk. So it's funded by the Energy Redress Fund, and our partners are, as I've mentioned, Repowering, but also an organisation called Energy Local and Connected Response. And so I'll talk you through that now. So the first thing is sort of levelling. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Well, as we're seeing more and more renewable assets being deployed across the built environment, and that's quite a jargonistic way of saying, as we see PV going up on roofs, where PV goes up on roofs of communal buildings, i.e. buildings where there's more than one occupant, whether they be domestic or commercial, what we actually find is that PV is exporting to the grid. It's not going to the people who live in the building below. So this whole issue of local, you know, some of it might go to the landlord's facilities for sort of lighting or lifts or something, but most of it actually gets exported to the grid. And then you've got grid losses and associated costs. So what we have a problem is local people can't access the local renewable power that's being generated above them. And asset owners are only getting a lower export tariff, whereby they could be accessing a higher price for their energy that they're generating. So Energy Local has come up with this wonderful solution where you create an energy purchasing co-op for local residents to join. Every member, once you join the energy local co-op, you join with the same energy supplier. That's the key unlock. Everybody has to have the same energy supplier. And in this particular project, that's Octopus, but it can be others. There's no reason why it couldn't be any energy supplier, as long as they understand the model and are willing to facilitate it. The asset owner signs a power purchase agreement, which basically means they also sell all their electricity to the same supplier. So once you've got everybody signed up to the same supplier, you essentially use the smart meters within the building to match whenever there's generation and there's consumption happening at the same time. There's this lovely term called sleeving. And so the energy retailer basically just puts the two together. And so once you put the two together, that means that local people are accessing the power that's being generated above them. And because of that, it's not going through all the grid and the transition networks. You can charge them a much lower price. And so they're making a significant saving on their energy, but also there is a midpoint, because the asset owner can charge a little bit more than they would normally get from exporting to the grid. And so we talk about this sort of Goldilocks point. So I think, Maria, in yours, you were talking about mutually beneficial transactions. Well, that's exactly what this is. This is about finding where is the mutually beneficial price point that gives residents or occupants of the building a lower price, but gives asset owners who own the renewables a higher price, and you meet in the middle. So what's in it for the energy supplier? Well, at the end of the day, they get customers, because if you've got, and for example, in our project, you've got up to 100 residents within one block. If they all sign up to the same supplier, suddenly they've got a lot more customers. So there's something in it for everyone. We do think it's mutually beneficial. And so just why levelling up? Why did we call it levelling up? Well, because we're particularly focusing on social housing tenants in this project, because they are the most vulnerable to fuel poverty, and often they're on prepay meters, and the prepay meters actually end up charging a higher price often, and they don't have the same flexibility. So that was our focus, was social housing. And often you find with social housing blocks, they've got communal PV arrays, but because the housing blocks are often not built by the social housing provider, there's often a neglect to sign up to any sort of feed-in tariffs that were available, and they're no longer available. So they're exporting the power, and they're not even sure when they're getting the money, and it's just not very well managed. So and then you've got these wonderful projects by Repowering, where they're going out and putting community-owned assets on top of roofs across the city. Well, let's get the best price for those, both for the residents and for the asset owner. So there's an obvious opportunity to apply this energy local model in the social housing sector. With all innovation, there are challenges. So I'm going to share some of the challenges, but I'm going to hopefully by the end communicate how a community-led approach has really helped us to circumnavigate some of those challenges. And we're still in the early stages of this. It's the end of a 2-year pilot phase. But we hope to circumnavigate them further. So the first problem, and this is an interesting one, is the legal structure of the Energy Local Club. When you collectivize residents to purchase energy, effectively they're purchasing that energy through a commercial contract with the landlord. And that makes some housing associations very nervous, because they're not used to negotiating terms with residents. So we found that that was a barrier. Secondly, just a historical thing, but fire safety has been a huge thing, and that has been a huge focus for social landlords. So they've put all their effort into cladding and recladding and safety measures, which is absolutely right to prioritise. And then we've had COVID. So it's been an absolutely horrendous time for social landlords over the last 4 years. And that's really taken away a lot of their focus. And so we're sort of slowly easing them back, but to ask them to take part in some sort of pilot where there wasn't an exactly proven model in this context has been quite challenging. So we've really struggled to get social landlords to sign up to our pilot. However, we've had a successful trial in the Repowering Park project in Brixton, and this is where Repowering have come in really strong. So Repowering, so I'll tell you, there's a number of conditions, and these are related to community, that have made it possible at Repowering Park, and then we can sort of extrapolate whether they're replicable elsewhere. So number one, it's actually a residence management company. It's not run by the social landlord, and so that's taken the focus off the social landlord and made things easier in a sort of engaging with residents. Secondly, we had, as you've heard before, Repowering had worked to help create Brixton Community Energy. So the asset, the PV that sat on the roof, was also not owned by the social landlord. It was owned by the local people of Brixton through their energy co-op. So you had parties who were much more willing and able to talk locally about getting things done locally. And then, no undue credit, Repowering had an existing long-term relationship with all the residents, doing all kinds of work, as you've heard from Afshin. So that meant there was trust, and there was also access, because this was a trusted entity that could come in, because ultimately the thing about this is residents have to choose to sign up. It's a choice thing, and they have to trust and believe that something's going to work and that it's going to save them money, and then they're not going to be worse off. So in the end, we've had metering challenges. The rollout of smart meters has been very challenging. But we've managed to do a sort of pseudo club with 16 residents to trial whether the economics of the model actually work. So we've got 16 residents who took part over 6 months, and we matched about 30% of their electricity demand to the supply. So that meant for every resident, about a third of their energy came locally rather than from the grid. And as a result of that, they make about a 20% saving on their bill. Now, we only did that for a 6-month period, and that 6-month period was during the summer when the solar's most productive. But overall, our early findings are that we think there's about a £90 to £100 saving per year for each resident. So not a huge money, but actually quite a significant amount of money if you're in or near fuel poverty. And it also increases the income for the asset owner as well. And so there's been much more expressions of interest, and we're looking to go live on the actual Energy Local Club in the coming months and take on board more residents. And what's nice about this model is it's totally scalable. So if you put more renewable asset on the roof, you can sign up more residents and you can create more savings. And it helps the business model to invest in renewables because you're getting a better export price. So finally, I just wanted to cover replicability. Really, I wanted to focus. So Bioregional's next project that we're currently working on is really how do you scale this up to also cover heat? Because we were only talking about power just then. But actually, heat is the biggest sort of carbon challenge we're facing, and we're seeing. There's a couple of observations I'd like to make which help make the context for this. So firstly, I'm sure lots of engineers will be aware of this, and many others may well be, carbon intensity of the grid is highly dependent on the exact time of day that you use energy. It's also dependent on the time of year that you use energy. The grid sort of oscillates up and down in terms of carbon intensity. And this is only going to increase with the advent of electric heating. We're talking about electrifying heating. That's going to cause a massive seasonal variance in demand, which is going to put strain on the grid. And as we increase renewables on the grid, we've got greater intermittency. So we've got quite a challenge in terms of managing the grid in a low carbon way. And most recently, we've seen some terrifying increases in electricity wholesale prices. So the vulnerability of people to price increase has worsened, and I think that's a real shock to the system. So there's definitely some work to do on that. So we need more than ever smart time of use and storage solutions to consuming renewable electricity locally. So we want to sort of step up what we've done already and look at it from a heat perspective as well. So we're looking at a range of business models for supplying residents with low cost renewable power from a combination of local generation and the grid, and how we can do that in a smart way, how we can do that in a way that's beneficial to local residents. And I think from our experience on the levelling project, community models have a significant role to play in helping us to do this. And that's because they help engage local residents, and it's all about choice. They encourage participation, and it's not only a choice to switch, it's also a choice of behaviors. If we're trying to shift when people use electricity because it's cheaper for them and it's greener, it's lower carbon. And it also, finally, it can keep the benefits local to the people who are most impacted and involved. So that's a really whistle-stop tour of the project and where we're going with it. But I hope that makes sense.
That's extremely helpful, Ronan. I mean, you talked about replicability. You finished on replicability. Are they, the way you described the leveling project, clearly an awful lot of grassroots work went into it, but yourselves and repowering. I mean, it's very, very time-intensive effort because you have to build that trust, you have to build those relationships, and you want the project to be as big as possible so that it helps with the overall, I guess, business case of it. So, do you have any tips you can offer other organisations who want to try and replicate that in different parts of the countries? Are there any sort of ways that you would suggest other groups could do those more, who may be very limited on resources? How can they sort of get these projects off the ground more as efficiently as possible, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically the magic ingredients is the right partners, and so you need a local partner. You need somebody who's trusted and known locally. Now, I don't think we didn't ask every housing association. There are smaller housing associations, particularly, who have much more intimate relationships with their residents and much more sort of open-minded about how they want to work with them. But I think, one thing we didn't get a chance to do much of, but Repowering have done lots of, is community champions. Really, this is a perfect vocational training opportunity. So one angle that you could go in is actually, do you empower and train up a local resident to actually help project manage and run the project, interfacing with the housing association, and whether there's a separate asset owner. But I mean, Energy Local are there as an entity and very much happy to partner and support from a kind of, if you like, they've got the model and they want to see it expanded and replicated. So they're very happy to sort of not franchise, but in that term, provide the IP and the model. But it requires grassroots entities or people who think they've got some kind of local connection that they could scale this up and apply it in their area.
That's really helpful, and I'm sure I've been sent a couple of questions actually, roughly on this similar area. So we'll come back to you during the Q&A, Ronan. But thank you very much. So we talked about the importance of creating a strong business case for some of those community schemes. So now it's time to focus on how can we best finance them and best support them. So Richard, over to you.
Morning, thank you for having me. And firstly, apologise for not being Whitney Thomas. Sadly, it is your loss, but I will do my best. She's not been able to make it. So I'm going to draw on a few examples, which some are in London, but some are from beyond London, and even worse, some aren't renewable energy projects even either, but they are community focused. So I think what we're looking at here is trying to draw on some examples that we can use. So I'll touch on those in a bit. So just very quickly, who is Redress Bank? So we're a sustainable bank, and we invest only in organisations that benefit people or the planet. And so we start with a question about what benefit the organisation has before we make any investments. We're a mid-sized European bank, and in the UK we have lending of just over £1 billion out to organisations, and that is direct investments into the real economy. So we don't invest in any complex financial projects. Everything is loans to business, basically. So we work across 3 categories, which includes environment, which is renewable energy, organic farming, a whole range of other topics within that, and then social and cultural, the other 2. And social covers charities, community projects, and social enterprises. And so we end up having a bit of an overlap between a few of those. And just in terms of renewable energy, we are a sort of global leader. We've been ranked top in terms of the clean energy pipeline global lead table for the last 5 years running. So just to give you a bit of context about what we do. So in terms of projects, what we do is generally, the £1 billion is all generally first charge security against assets. It includes development funding, but it is lending based on that. And then the team that I'm in is the corporate finance team, and we raise money from outside of the bank. So this is from either institutions or individual investors through our crowdfunding platform, and that's a direct investment into those organisations. And so that includes the same sorts of organisations, but is on a much smaller scale. So we typically raise about 2 million for each of those organisations, from 300,000 to sort of 8 to 10 million, but typically it's about 2 million, and we probably raise about 10 to 20 million a year during that. So there's a couple of examples just to touch on. So we've recently funded Ember, which is an electric bus company up in Scotland. So that's taking security against the assets of the buses. In terms of, this is just some examples of sort of slightly newer technologies. We've also been a lender to PodPoint, who are an EV charging company. So that was a partnership with Tesco. And the idea is that the chargers there are based in the car parks, and you can charge as you go. And there's some interesting points to look at that in terms of new business models that we can touch on later. And then specifically in around London, we are invested into the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund. An example of that is one of those investments is the Epsom and St Helier University Hospital, and that was funding to provide energy efficiency across the trust. So it was for LED lighting, increased insulation, and changing the energy usage for heating. In terms of the team I'm in, one of the renewable projects we've been looking at recently is around ground source heat pumps. So it's we're doing a second bond with an organisation at the moment, but the first one we did was to help them roll out their heat pumps in retirement flats. So they were new build retirement flats, and they put their central heat pump in before the foundations go in, and the building gets built on top. And the arrangement that they had was that the residents would get free hot water and heating, but they would pay for the electricity for the pumps through the service charge, and the company would get the RHI income, the government subsidy. So that was a way that they'd managed to kind of create a bit of a sort of win-win-win for everybody within that. So the people building the property didn't pay for the heat pump in the first place. They therefore didn't put in, a gas or oil system, and the residents got a cheaper heating. Which sort of touches on a little bit. So that was a private company, and most of those that we've just talked about are private companies, but we're also looking at that through, this is a sort of opportunity for a just transition, and one that is more democratic, regenerative and redistributive. And I think what we've seen a good way of doing that is through the kind of community-owned models. It's been touched on a little bit earlier, and particularly repowering, but the idea firstly around just changing the ownership structure, but then it goes a little bit beyond that as well. And so we've raised money for quite a few ground-mounted solar schemes where there's basically quite a simple structure in that you just change the ownership structure, the profits therefore go into a community fund, and you can redistribute them. But there are other opportunities where we've seen community groups having quite a difference. And I think this is one of the things I was asked to talk about was greatest opportunities. And I think where community groups can have a difference is where their structure is an advantage. So this is the example I wanted to pull in for broadband for the rural north, which if any of you haven't come across them, you should look at them. They're a fantastic organisation. And what they do is install gigabit capable broadband in areas that currently isn't any sort of fibre broadband. And the reason that they can do that is that they engage with the local community, so the local community grant them access across the land, so they don't have to dig up any roads, so their cost of installation is significantly cheaper. They've also got an audience willing to buy the broadband when they get there, and then they also raise community capital from those organisers, from the villages. So they go to the village, they set them a target of community shares that they need to raise before they'll install it, and then they go and install it and do it. They've raised 5 million, or at the point we raised a bond for them, they'd raised 5 million from the local community, and they've been connecting the villages throughout. So what they had was the different ownership structure meant that those profits will be either extending the network or reinvesting into the local area. The different capital means that they've got that long-term patient capital through community shares. So there's that you can withdraw them by request, but the company only pays that if they can. And actually the requests they've had have been incredibly low. And they've got that cheaper actually installation cost because the community is on side and they're delivering something that the community wants. And so that just seems to be such a great way of delivering something in a way that actually the commercial organisations weren't going to go there. They weren't even going to go to those villages, and actually they've managed to do it in a better way than they would have been able to. And I think that's probably where, in terms of any areas that are kind of being missed out, I think it's just that opportunity to change those ownership structures. I think the other thing that community groups have as well is some of these things are going to be quite complicated. So particularly around heating, for example, has been touched on earlier, but it's not just changing the way there's the heat, you also have to insulate the homes, you might have to change the radiators, there's a whole kind of connection of things. And exactly as Ronan was talking about earlier, I think that community groups offer that way of being the kind of the face of that engagement, but also you need a vehicle to be able to do some of these things. And so if that is a community vehicle, you can still have private companies involved, you can still have residents involved, but I think gathering people around that single known entity that you trust because of the structure of it, I think is quite a good way of doing some of those complicated things, or at least starting to. And I think what we've seen we've done a little bit work with repowering as well, but also with other areas, is that you do need that professionalization in some of these areas because they are complicated. You do need those skills, and we've probably seen it with community land trusts most, where they're trying to deliver community housing projects, and that they can take 5 to 10 years to get off the ground because people are learning that for the first time every time. And I think with something like this, where the technical side of it is quite high, I think having that element of professionalism alongside the benefits of community ownership and maybe even community finance are probably the good combination to do.
Thank you, Richard. Really helpful to just get that sort of really practical, you had to have all these practical examples. You mentioned the piece around the importance of having the right structure. Is that often the main barrier to finance before, when you decide when to finance a particular community project? Is the structure often what stands in the way, or is it you also talked about, when you talked about low carbon heat, you talked about the importance of really thinking about the project as a whole, so your insulation with your low carbon heat sources. Is that where the problem tends to be? Where are the main barriers?
So I think, no, I'd say it's more based on just the certainty of return, I guess. So if you took generation with the feed-in tariff, for example, when you have a feed-in tariff, it makes a completely different investable model. The structure could basically be anything. If you're getting a 20-year income stream that is inflation linked and government backed, that's a very different proposition from somebody who's saying, well, actually we're going to put it, we're building it on a site with this company, and there'll be an arrangement with them, and they'll probably put a couple of year PPA in, or there's just that increased certainty means that the investing is much clearer. So if you take the Pod Point, for example, there's a big uncertainty about how many people are going to charge their cars at Tesco's. So they want to put them in, they want to be seen to be doing that, and they want the facility there. But how many spaces do you need? How many cars are going to be there? What's the income going to be? And so actually that one worked because there was also advertising revenue on those sites. So the point to actually have TV screens that they can advertise on. And so it's that idea that sometimes you might need a different model that includes other revenue streams. You might need to come up with a different way of doing it, because at the moment some of these things are a bit too uncertain.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Andrew, very keen to come to you. So obviously West London business works a wide range of businesses in West London. So you see a lot of different kinds of community projects happening on the ground. So it'd be great to hear a bit more about what some of your members are up to. And I think you've got some slides for us.
I do, not too many, I hope, but I'm going to try and keep them as visual as possible. For those of you that are new to West London business, we've been going for over 25 years. Our geography is actually very much Northwest London. We map onto the 7 boroughs of the Northwest London Alliance, from Hammersmith and Fulham, Hounslow, wrapping all the way around to Barnet. And as well as that sort of broad geography, I also wear the hat of Chief Executive of the Park Royal Business Group. And for anyone that hasn't spent time in Park Royal recently, it's the UK's largest, most successful industrial estate, 1,700 businesses and 43,000 workers within the industrial estate. So sometimes described as London's kitchen for the predominance of food businesses that fuel the capital. Now, at West London Business, over the past I suppose 6 years now, we've been working in close partnership with Imperial College London, City Hall and Sustainable Ventures on the Better Futures programme, which some of you may have come across. If it's new to you, do visit the betterfutures.london website. But that collaboration has been supporting almost 200 clean tech pioneers across the capital, across a whole range of different sectors, many spinning out of London's universities and generating really high value, high quality, scalable sort of clean tech businesses that are also serving a global community as well as the UK community now. What we realised at the end of last year was that actually we needed to start to, I suppose, work much more with mainstream businesses to support them on their transition to net zero. And at this point, I'm going to pause to start my screen share if that's okay. It gave birth to Better Futures Plus. I have to say, not very originally named, but a build on the original Better Futures programme, and it's grant funded by the Mayor of London and indeed now the London Business Hub. We worked with a pilot group of about a dozen companies in the first half of this year, a group of companies that were committed to transitioning to net zero by 2030, and it's a broad package of support that we've put together, from an online tool, Climate Essentials, that allows them to measure their carbon footprint and plan their transition to net zero, a leadership program initially developed with Imperial College's business school, peer learning groups, the list goes on. So it's quite a comprehensive intervention to help business leaders really kind of kickstart the transition. And we've now got a second round of funding. So over the next 14 months, we hope to work with 500 SMEs across the capital in this transition. So please spread the word. I think relevant to today's discussion, I think what becomes very clear as you work through any organizations sort of net zero transition and sort of through scope 1, scope 2 conversations, and then open up the sort of can of worms that can be scope 3, is that you realize actually in what can be very complex transitions, how much is beyond the control of any one organization. The extent we've got to work in partnership and collaborate with supply chains, with customers, with the communities that surround us. And I suppose how that's starting to translate through on the ground in West London. Well, on the mobility front, which clearly we cannot escape the need for modal shift and new ways of getting around our capital. I suppose two particular fronts that have been working with our members and the wider business community. One is around more orbital rail transport. Goodness, we've been plugging away probably for 20 years, dare I admit, to try and get a West London orbital railway in place. Where we're now actually making quite considerable progress is in the proposal to convert a relatively underused freight line, the Dudding Hill line that runs from Kew Bridge up to Old Oak and then on up to Brent Cross, into a passenger carrying service again. And for 400 million, which in the world of transport interventions is a relatively small amount of investment, we can get this passenger carrying service with a probably sort of battery sort of powered train in place and in service within not very many years. So a big push there, well supported by our business community. Much more complex conversations and politically sensitive around cycle lanes. I have to say, as an organisation, we've stuck our neck out on multiple occasions to support new cycling infrastructure being put in place in the west of the capital. A little known fact is that by Hanger Lane gyratory system in West London, we actually had the first cycle lanes in the UK installed back in the sort of 1920s, 1930s. So I would love to see that by 2030 we have a comprehensive completed cycle network in West London 100 years on from that first bit of cycle lane being put down. In Park Royal specifically, where our attention has shifted over the past few years, working in very close partnership with the Mayor's Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation and the leadership particularly of Dan Epstein and their sustainability lead within the OPDC, is to look at the heat network opportunity, which with the volume of data centres that is now proposed in Park Royal is I think front and fore of the planning authority's mind. You can see that on the sort of screen here, both those that are existing, those that are in the sort of planning pipeline to come through, and the volume of heat that these data centers are going to generate is at a scale that we think potentially the 25,000 new homes that are going to be built in the Westlands area, which is sort of surrounding the new HS2 station at Old Oak, could potentially all be fully heated by those data centers. And it's quite a unique opportunity, we think, nationally because of the proximity of such a volume of data centers to a sort of high density sort of living area. So a lot of work now happening there. I think the consultants are just being commissioned to start to move us into a sort of more detailed technical design phase. Alongside that, and an earlier sort of project that started sort of a few years ago, is the solar opportunity that Park Royal presents. If you go on Google Maps and zoom out from West London, the kind of two blobs that you will see, one is the rooftops of all the industrial sort of buildings of Park Royal, and the other is Heathrow's runways. So concentrating on Park Royal and those rooftops, that we've been through a few phases of sort of supported work by consultants to identify some of the quick wins, and we're now, just in the past few weeks, we've gone out to a sort of target group of Park Royal businesses with a prospectus that we've been the OPDC has been developing, supported by the consultancy Syzygy. And that really is to handhold the business community through the process of getting solar in place. If your primary concern is actually whether you can get the volume of food out to fill supermarket shelves every day, actually you probably don't have the in-house knowledge and capacity to make full use of the opportunity that's above your head. So we're making it as simple as possible. And I think it was mentioned earlier by one of my fellow panelists, both the power purchase agreement opportunity and sleeving, that is coming through in our conversations. And clearly, we will be trying to get the businesses working in as collaborative a sort of form as possible as we firm up the sort of first phase of installations. And then finally, just to say we're also having probably more sort of detailed conversations than we have previously. It's around the local procurement opportunity and challenge. There's been, I think, quite a significant push from City Hall around the role of anchor institutions, whether that's the NHS, large businesses, universities, to revisit procurement from a social and environmental perspective. And numerous institutions have put policies in place over the past 15 years, but actually that translation of policy into practice is where we all know, I think, around this table, it can so often get stuck. And on the local procurement piece, what comes through in our conversations with heads of procurement is that actually they may have opportunities that are locally relevant, but they just don't know who the local businesses are to go and tap on the door of and encourage to tender for bids. So we're now looking at whether there are specialist intermediaries like localsupplychain.co.uk that some of our construction sector partners might want to work with to give them that extra helping hand. Or in the case of our universities, we're currently running a pilot project using the Bohurst database as a means to come up with lists of local businesses in close proximity to our university partners that could be invited to start to become part of their supply chains. So lots happening, and very happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And just a quick question for me before we move to the Q&A. So when you showed those different projects, the solar rooftop projects, the heat projects early on, how much of you obviously involve a lot of local business and you raise awareness of those projects with local businesses, but how much do you engage local authorities and local residents as part of that? As part of that sort of trying to get the benefits to spill over to, I guess, residents beyond just those working for those local businesses.
Yeah, I think on the sort of on the solar sort of piece and sort of heat networks. I mean, clearly the heat networks piece particularly is going to very much bring businesses and residents closer together, as one will be sort of feeding the other. I think we've also in the Central Middlesex Hospital, which is in the heart of Park Royal, also potentially got the opportunity to heat a hospital. I suppose more broadly, where we find our work connects residents and businesses is of course around skills and local employment opportunities. Again, that can be more easily said than done. And again, we're sort of going back around the loop at the moment with a number of our partners to look at some of the mechanics and how we sort of improve some of the systems in West London to make it easier for local people and businesses to be matched up with each other. There are a number of intermediary functions often housed by our local authority partners, but it can be quite fragmented. And I suppose from a business community perspective, businesses tend not to think in terms of boroughs and borough boundaries. They tend to look at larger labour markets and sort of recruitment pools. So it's how we get over that.
Really helpful, thank you, and just great that you could get all these maps out and just help us really see the reality of some of those projects within that particular area. Okay, so we're getting quite a few questions coming through the Q&A, and I've had another 4 coming to me directly. So we're gonna try and do 2 rounds of questions and cover as much as we can. First question, and only answer the question if you don't feel like you have to answer all the questions, panelists, because otherwise we could be there for quite a long time. First question: how much of the net zero transition should be driven by national policy, and how much needs to be driven by local policy? Then we have another question around what are the key steps you would recommend that businesses take to benefit climate and community beyond their own operations. And Afshin, there's a particular question there for you as well around whether you could say a bit more, maybe as part of this, in terms of how businesses can join the Build a Solar City initiative. question on finance, predominantly directed to Richard. You spoke about the feed-in tariffs and how that had really sort of helped investment in solar and onshore wind take off about 10 years ago. Are there other likely government initiatives that could help fund more low-carbon community projects? And can you give, I guess, examples of what those could be? So and then a question for Smith, what can organizations that are stewarding resources do to ensure they are not included with those who are extracting resources and hoarding wealth? So let's go, maybe if we start with you, Afshin.
Sure. I will take the Build a Solar City initiative, but I do also want to touch on the policy and the national and local. So Build a Solar City initiative, there are so many ways in which businesses can get involved through either offering their roofs for community owned solar power stations and schemes. That's often a challenge to find, particularly in London, the business owners are generally not the business occupiers. So that's one way of offering support. Another way is by contributing towards the community fund. As I said, the community fund provides benefits to the local area through training or tackling fuel poverty. Particularly for our Build a City initiative, we want to focus it on building apprenticeships for young people. So there's a way of contributing and sponsoring a training package. Another way could be if you have skills, resources to give. Companies might have, for example, cranes or scaffolding that might not be in use at a particular time, and they can reduce the capital cost for installing the solar panels. So there are different ways in which we are open to collaborating with businesses on this. And I think particularly if we want to get to net zero, then that collaboration between businesses, community and local authorities is so key. And we can't do this on our own in our own little silos, and that integration is so needed. When on the point on policy, Nick, I think there's a combination of both. We of course need national policy to support and kick drive the market, but we need national policy to recognise the local as well, and the power of local and decision making that needs to happen at a local level. And there is that element of, again, as I said, that local authorities have a key role to play in getting to net zero. And what we find is local authorities crack on with their plans, but don't really bring the community with them necessarily. And that alliance again of local authorities and communities is a really fantastic one. And we've seen a lot of community initiatives flourish where that collaboration takes place. And as I said, North Kensington Community Energy wouldn't be there if the local authority didn't really support it. So that kind of connection at all levels is needed. And we can't say that only national is needed, local or local can solve all the problems. We need to integrate.
Yeah. I guess the point behind the question, actually another question, similar questions come in around we need local authorities to be better resourced to support the shift to net zero, but how do you also ensure that they are coordinated? So, but I guess it comes from the fact that so far the immediate instinct of climate policy has been to drive everything at the national level. And now obviously we're entering a different phase. Andrew, and then Sam, it'd be great to sort of have your views on that question as well before we move on to the other ones.
Yeah, I suppose brief reflections. I mean, absolutely, clearly, we've got to get it right nationally, locally, in the middle. I suppose, where we get quite frustrated in some of our, I suppose, energy conversations in Park Royal is how sometimes regulatory framework seems to be struggling to keep up, and Ofgem clearly has a critical role to play there. We're having to at a local level broker conversations between two DNOs, SSE and UKPN, who cover different bits of Park Royal, to make sure that they start to factor in our local ambitions to their sort of future forecasting, because I mean, at a headline level, the amount of electricity that's going to move across the grid may increase 2.5 times over the next decade. We're already getting kind of meltdowns with a tired, sort of fragile grid in Park Royal. So the need for investment is absolutely critical. And I suppose, in terms of that, that practical sort of question of, what should, could be businesses be sort of, getting on with sort of right now in terms of climate, community benefit. I mean, one of the things that we're looking at as an organisation when it comes to West London businesses, sort of scope 3 sort of spend, is our pension fund, which clearly has huge ripple effects in terms of where our staff members' pensions are invested, and we're currently talking to our provider Aviva around switching our default fund to a climate sort of friendly option.
Thanks very much. And so Simon, and I think Ronan, you're going to want to come in those points as well. So, but Sam first.
Yeah, not too much to add. I mean, I think probably I would echo what Andrew says. There's lots of practical implementation things that not worry me, but we're giving more attention to than the policy pieces. I think that that will be done by others probably, but here we're doing a lot on that. And I think probably the other bit Andrew says about that, sort of looking at the funding, financing part of it, and so I think people getting connected between the the communities and the practical solutions, and companies being able to offer fixes and solutions and sharing how it's worked elsewhere is a really successful way of accelerating things in our experience. So just being able to replicate things, not doing something in London that's creating something in London that's already been done elsewhere. So just really being able to tap into that knowledge and information base, I think, is going to be a key accelerator.
Thank you. Ronan?
Yeah, I would echo the comments about Ofgem. They just need to catch up, and that is just, and the DNOs, so the district network operators are not really coming up. I mean, they're coming up with 5-year strategies that just aren't keeping pace with the rate of change that we need for the grid. There was a question about sort of grant for renewables. There is the Clean Homes grant that I would point people towards in terms of heat. In terms of PV, I'm not aware that there are any more grants, but which is bad. So that means we need more and more of the kind of model I was describing. So what I would say is it's all about, I think, I really liked Richard's point, the internet installation company, I forgot their name. That's a great example. Like, what we need to investigate more is community and crowdsourcing finance, but also looking at people purchasing and benefiting from the services locally and making that business model stack up on its own 2 feet, so that we don't have to rely on government grants which seem to come and go and change with every sort of year that comes. So I think that there is a sort of thing around locally resilient, community-focused business models that can really help plug some of those gaps.
Thanks very much, Ronan. Smith, would you like to take the questions around essentially how do we distinguish corporate organisations who are trying to do the right things from those who aren't? And whilst we're at it, also any suggestions you have around how can organisations like ours and other organisations in this space best use language to talk about some of the benefits that, if we do it right, can flow from the net zero transition?
Sure. First, I want to applaud Ronan on the use of the word bad there. I think we don't hear enough about it. It's just like, no, that's bad, like explicit language, big fan. But I mean, I suppose to answer the first question, 2 things. I think one thing, so many things that we've heard from esteemed panelists this morning are kind of, and I say this with love, but kind of ways of hacking the system. It's like we're trying to achieve something that the system isn't really set up to facilitate, but we're trying to use it. And thinking about, Richard's talking about, persuading Tesco's to install those electric charging points by sort of making sure that there's another revenue stream and so on. So I think one way is that, we just need to be explicit about where we're trying to do something different, but we're using the sort of the levers that we can to try and achieve that within the current system. But I think the other thing I would say, and I think this goes to both of the final questions really, is like just trying to be as explicit as possible. And if we can, organisations that are trying to steward resources can be explicit about that, can get together with other organisations that are trying to steward resources and explicitly campaign for the kind of policies and so on that are rewarding that rather than rewarding extraction and exploitation and hoarding of wealth, then that's also going to help us get further. I think that all language does tend to get co-opted by power. A panel event the other day, the CEO of McDonald's was talking about regenerative agriculture. It's like, is that really what you mean? And I don't think we're going to win that. I don't think it's either also sort of fair to sort of keep just changing our language over and over and over again, because okay, no, that means something else. We can't say sustainable anymore. We can't say regenerative anymore.
Because it will always get co-opted.
Well, it will. So I think we just have to sort of keep saying, no, I mean this and I don't mean this, and just keep using as clear language as possible. Yeah, it's an endless fight, isn't it?
But really important food for thought. So thank you. We've got just under 10 minutes left, and there's another two questions that I wanted to, I guess, conclude the event with. Actually, my apologies. Before I do that, Richard, I wanted to go to you to the finance question on feed-in tariff. So let's go to you first.
Yeah, sure. I guess the point about the feed-in tariff was the certainty of the income, and I guess the point of it is really just, in terms of my view of where it should be, is around that risk balance. So in the comment just now, my role isn't here to defend Tesco's, but the point of that was Pod Point's business model, and so they were trying to generate a business around charging, so slightly separate from whether Tesco want the chargers or not. And I guess that's just a slightly different point around whether we're actually trying to create business out of this, or whether we actually need utilities and services that are provided by the state or something else. So I guess that's a slight difference. But yeah, in terms of subsidies, and there isn't much in terms of tax breaks at the moment. So what I think would be quite helpful, potentially not that big of an ask for government, might be to extend the social investment tax relief. So if you were doing this specifically within the remit of social businesses, I think one of the criticisms of the feed-in tariff was the level of extraction of profits from the various people as they went along, that the risk, balance between the risk and reward potentially wasn't right at certain points. And maybe if that was within social vehicles, that might be slightly less of an ask. So for example, social investment tax relief at the moment excludes energy generation, and it also excludes rental and property ownership. It follows the same rules as the EIS, and you also have to be less than 7 years old. So if those were broadened out because those vehicles are more socially beneficial, that might be a helpful way of doing it. But it's trying to balance that level of risk. So I think the point that Ronan's showing around the rooftop solar is that maybe that risk isn't quite as high as it once was, because the technology works, and actually what you're trying to do is work out the incentives for the business model. But what we are looking at with certain things like EV chargers is that there's uncertainty over the revenue, so maybe you need something there.
So staying actually on that theme, we've had another two questions. One of them I think specifically directed to you, Richard, around aggregation of finance. So a lot of community schemes will at times struggle to attract finance because they are too small. What can banks like Triodos do to sort of, I guess, aggregate different projects to make these individual schemes therefore easier to finance and hopefully cheaper to finance? And then another question, which I was going to possibly direct at Afshin, Andrew and Ronan, but if anybody else would like to come in, just raise your hand. In your experience of working on projects with local authorities or local businesses and local residents, how aware are residents and these organisations of the UK's climate targets, and are further awareness campaigns needed? So I'll start with the finance question with you, Richard, and then Afshin, Andrew and Ronan, I'll come to you, and then we'll close the session.
Yeah, so I'll try and be quick. I guess again it goes a little bit back to that point about risk. So if you were asking somebody to invest in something, they need to know what it is that they're investing in. So if you're aggregating lots of different things, that makes that quite hard. One of the things that we've been looking at is trying to separate where people might be investing. So one of the things that often happens is with community projects, you say, why don't we have community shares or some sort of community involvement? But actually, if that involves an early level of construction, for example, that might be quite an inappropriate level of risk for retail investors to be involved in. So is there a way that you can separate out some sort of way of having maybe institutions to do that bit, and then it gets refinanced when the risk has been reduced by retail investors? So that's a project we've been looking at recently, and so it's just trying to put those balances together. But yeah, community shares is a common one, but I'm not sure I'm completely comfortable with saying that is the way that all of these kind of high risk and complex things should be funded, because actually there are people who need to understand those risks to invest in that as well. So, at Triodos we are doing that. We do kind of community bonds and shares, but we, as a bank, and that bank lending just needs to be very clear what you're investing in, and that's the complexity about the aggregating side, I guess.
Thanks very much, Richard. I think it goes back to your point about needing to think outside the box, have innovative approaches, and really judge each project for its own merit and adapt the solution that best works with that project, which is important to remember. Afshin, I'll come to you last so you can sort of wrap up the event. But Ronan and then Andrew, it'd be great to have your take on that broader question about awareness.
And sorry, it was awareness in which organisation?
Well, in your experience of working on specific projects with local residents and local authorities, how aware are they of the UK's climate targets and the whole net zero transition? Do you feel that actually the knowledge, the sense of direction is there already, and it's just a question of getting projects off the ground, or is there? Should we also be focusing on raising? Do we need to raise further awareness of the targets and why we are on that transition?
I mean, our experience of local authorities is they are extremely aware. Most of them have made climate declarations in keeping with or in advance of government policy. So I think the stage they're at is, oh dear, how do we do this? So they've made that commitment, they've made that leap, and now they're sort of terrifyingly scratching at solutions which sort of haven't been invented yet for the rate of change that we need to achieve. With local organisations, I would say, people are, the sorts of people we're engaging with are typically quite aware, but I think, for example, on the latest project we're working on, our primary goal is not carbon reduction. That is a useful co-benefit, and we want to achieve it. But the primary is to come up with a replicable business model that is mutually beneficial, because we know that if we can do that part, it will happen again and again. And yes, then you achieve that climate reduction. If we prioritize climate reduction at the expense of the business model, it's a one-off project. So I just wanted to sort of add that sort of nuance there.
Very good point, thank you. And then now Andrew, and then Afshin to close things off.
I suppose the simple answer to our residents, organisations we work with are aware. Absolutely, yes. I think what we do find is that certainly as businesses and SMEs, start to model their carbon footprint for the first time, there can be real surprises as to where different concentrations of carbon may exist across the different scopes. Surprises when they take a step back and reflect on what's perhaps going to be most material in terms of how they should be prioritising interventions and the implications, as we touched upon earlier, in terms of collaboration, both horizontally and vertically across supply chains. And then I think, we always circle back in the conversations to just how time poor most SMEs are, and that the solutions therefore need to be kept as simple as possible. That's not always possible, but where they can be kept simple, we need to make sure that we do the matching and provide that support.
No, that's an important one, because I think SMEs can often be forgotten in that debate. Sam, I don't know if I saw your hand. Did you want to come in? No? Okay, so we'll move to you, Afshin, and I'll let you close our session as well.
Oh, great. Thanks, Nick. Few thoughts on what's already been said. Clearly, language, the language is really important. Speaking the truth is really important. What we have seen in our experience, the communities that we work in are well aware, even if they know what they need to do. They're very much informed, and often people don't think that the communities know what they need to do and how they can be involved. Smart meters, I remember working in this field 10 years ago, and and it was about, switch to energy efficient light bulbs, or boil a cupful, not a kettleful. They've been there, done that. They want practical action. They want to understand how they could benefit from the heat pumps. They want to understand what's going to happen, with their boiler replacements. They are really on it. They understand how to read their energy bills. And of course, there are those who are excluded, digitally excluded, or have other disadvantages, and they need to be given a handheld, tailored service. So I appreciate that is the case as well. But don't underestimate the knowledge that the community have. And in terms of language, net zero climate targets don't mean anything to the local resident and the person, in their day-to-day living. But what really gets them excited and really into these projects is social justice and equity, inclusion, wanting to have a fair opportunity, really. So I think we need to keep that in mind when engaging people. And when we talk about business models, I agree, we need to make resilient business models, but let's just put it out there. This is not a level playing field. We do need some level of government support, and you know, the fossil fuel industries and other large corporates have benefited from subsidies or benefits in one shape or the other. And even today we're looking at that. So how about allowing some support for, be it financial support or policy support, to bring that level playing field so community business models can thrive and flourish as well. And here we are today in a climate emergency. So we really need to scale and replicate, and we need to do it fast. So yes, the Sam's point about, you know, really sharing the learning, connecting with each other, the collaboration that we need is absolutely essential for us to get to net zero. So let's not be precious about our boundaries, and let's kind of share, innovate, and come together in a collaborative sense so we can get to that more fairer, just future that we want to get to. So I'd like to, on that note, thank Nick really you know, fantastic chairing of the session. Thank you so much to Aldersgate Group to partner with us today, and also thank you very much for speakers for your excellent contributions, and hope we can all be connected after today as well. And the same goes to our participants who joined us today this morning. I hope you can spread the word around. We will send you links to the video recording, so if you want to share that beyond your networks, please do send us some feedback if you want us to run some more of these sessions, and how it went and what you took away from these events. And thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening.